Well, one thing is certain. During her short time on this planet, blonde bombshell Jayne Mansfield definitely made an impact. Whether it be through her film and television work, her scintillating modeling career, or just plain being, Jayne sure knew how to draw a crowd. But as with any phenomenon, there's always a lot going on beneath the surface that the public didn't know about. Author April VeVea joins us. Her book is called Puffblicity, An Appreciation of Jayne Mansfield, The 50s Pictures, Volume 1. And with a title like that, one would assume that a second volume focusing on the 60s is forthcoming?
Yes, you are spot on with that. Volume 2 should be out this summer.
Wonderful, because we're going to cover both the 50s and the 60s in this discussion. But before we begin, we're Facebook friends now, you and I, and you're a lovely young lady. How does someone your age become so intrigued with Jayne Mansfield, a figure from the past, that you go beyond just having an interest several levels to writing a book about Jayne Mansfield?
So I actually grew up on classic film. I watched a lot of Betty Grable and Shirley Temple growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And then after my grandpa passed away, kind of went away from it. And then when I was 16, I got really invested in Marilyn Monroe. And I did that for almost 10 years. And Jayne just seemed like the logical progression from Marilyn.
And you know what? That's probably how I learned about Jayne Mansfield, too, through being a fan of Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn, of course, is an icon to this day, recognizable all over the world. It seems to me, though, that Jayne's fame, and goodness knows she worked really hard for it, Jayne's fame seems to have faded over the years. Do you see that as well?
I work with 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds, for a living as a professor, and a lot of them don't even know who Jayne is, and they haven't seen the Sophia Loren photo, which, of course, is,
Right.
iconic in my eyes.
Right.
But the thing with Jayne, she does have a very limited filmography, and she only really had 2 years of stardom, 56 to 58. And then it's pretty much all downhill from there. And the main thing with Jayne is people look at her as this Marilyn impersonator, but I always like to talk about her, not to her. I'm not quite at that level. But I always like to talk about how she's more of a second coming of, this sexy blonde bombshell. She's not so much imitating Marilyn as she's putting her own spin on the whole ditzy blonde who has a nice figure. And Jayne is much more blatant with everything that she does versus how Marilyn was. Marilyn still has, that kind of innocence about her. But as far as how their memories have held up, yes, there is definitely a much greater appreciation for Marilyn. And Jayne is kind of looked at as like this pretender to the throne, especially in the Maryland community. But Jayne has her place. She really helped blend sexual magnetism, I guess you could say, in comedy. And we still see sex in comedy today. And I think that a lot of that can go back to Jayne and Marilyn.
Here she is, Jayne Mansfield, right here. At ease. Jayne, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for bringing me up here to Sun Valley.
Well, I lied, and I'm glad. No, I apologize, Jayne, but I wanted you to see Alaska. How do you like our new estate?
Oh, I like it much better than those used ones.
Jayne?
And besides, 13 was such an unlucky number. When I first heard you were going to Alaska, I could hardly wait. I mean, it's so big here. There's room to breathe.
Well, the rest of us can manage even in Rhode Island.
It's a real thrill to be in a state that's just been admitted to the Union, though I suppose it's no novelty to you.
No, after Virginia, I lost interest. Tell me, Jane, have you done any sightseeing?
Oh, no, I haven't had a chance to go anywhere or do anything. There's so many men around.
Yes, there
What
are.
are they staring at? Haven't they ever seen blonde hair before?
Only on huskies. But it was nice of you to rush back from England in time to make this trip. What were you doing over there?
Well, I was making a picture called Too Hot to Handle.
Uh-huh.
Wait till you see it. It's in widescreen.
Sure it is.
You know, in many ways, Jayne Mansfield was ahead of her time. You know, nowadays we live in the age of social media and everyone's looking to generate publicity and get more clicks and get more likes. And she seemed to be a master at doing that, and it almost seemed effortless for her.
Yeah, there's a term for it, but it's not very polite, so I don't use that. But we'll just say that Jane was a publicity hound. Jane was able to, really promote herself, and that's how she got on the map and got herself signed, was at a publicity junket. She knew what people were interested in. She knew what would make the headlines. If something wasn't happening, Jane would make something happen. Earl Wilson would recall in one of his books that, if Jane discovered that her name wasn't in the paper, she would call him up and give him a story. And one time she did that, but she had already given the same story to Walter Winchell, and Earl Wilson told her, if you're going to call me up with a story, you better make sure you haven't given it to somebody else already.
And it has to be said, like I mentioned in the introduction for this, there was much more going on beneath the surface, because Jane was a smart cookie. I did some research on her, and I found out she was, fluent in 4 languages?
She was actually fluent in 5. And her 6th language that she could speak a little bit of was Hungarian, but she could speak German, Spanish, French, Italian, and obviously English. I shouldn't say fluent, though. There are arguments as to how fluent she really was, but we do know that she was for sure fluent in German and Spanish.
Sex, das soll ich in einen Satz beschreiben? Ich kann nicht mal die Atombombe in einen Satz beschreiben. Und Sex ist doch wirklich viel explosiver als die Atombombe.
Jane reportedly had an IQ of 163. She had a certificate it was most likely from University of Texas, Austin. It was in the back of one of her scrapbooks and sadly has not resurfaced, but she would proudly show it off and talk about how, when she took an IQ test, she received a score of 163. And Jane was extremely intelligent in a lot of aspects. She was well-read. She could, play the piano. She could play the violin. And she had an incredible business sense. She was smart enough to get involved in real estate before, that really took off. And she owned a lot of properties around the Los Angeles area, including several apartment complexes.
And as I understand it, New Jersey played a part in Jane's upbringing. We could claim her in New Jersey if we wanted to.
You know what? You should claim her. You should just make that New Jersey's new motto, the birthplace of Jayne Mansfield.
Absolutely.
Jane actually was born in New Jersey, and she spent her developing years in New Jersey. Unfortunately, her father passed away when she was 3, and her mom took her back to Pennsylvania, but she lived in Hagerstown, New Jersey.
You know what? They should put a statue up. If we can have a statue of Lou Costello in Paterson, his hometown, we can certainly have a statue of Jayne Mansfield.
Yeah, you know what? I support this 100%.
Yeah. Why not? And we mentioned that Jane was often compared to Marilyn, and certainly in the Marilyn fan community, that they probably look down on her. Do we know what Marilyn herself thought of Jane?
So there are differing accounts of that. Some people say that Marilyn really gave, no thought to Jane. And other people like to claim that she thought Jane was a publicity hound and that Jane didn't think, there was room for both of them, but there was. If I was going to make an educated guess, I would say that Marilyn probably wasn't overly fond of Jayne. Jayne was, 7 years younger. She's blonder. She's, more bosomy, which, of course, in the 50s is like a huge thing. On the opposite side of that coin, Marilyn, when Jayne was signed in 1956, Marilyn was really trying to focus on dramatic roles. She was doing Bus Stop and The Prince and the Showgirl, and Jayne was looking at doing lighthearted fare that was more so like Marilyn's work in The 7-Year Itch and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes.
Do we know if Jayne had similar aspirations to, be a serious dramatic actress, or was she just thrilled to be doing mainly comedies? She was doing a lot of comedies.
Yeah, so in 1956, Jayne actually talked about wanting to go and work at the Actors Studio. Of course, that never came to fruition. When Jayne first went to Hollywood back in 1954, she had actually wanted to play dramatic roles, and she had wanted to do them with her naturally, brunette hair. And she was told by Milton Lewis, who works at Paramount, that she would need to dye her hair blonde because he couldn't focus on what she was saying due to her figure. She discovered that people did not want somebody who looked like her to be smart. And if she would, play up and dye her hair blonde and play this really ditzy role, she would become famous off of it. And that's exactly what she did. After later in her career, starting, around 58, she went off to England and she filmed Too Hot to Handle and The Challenge. And she discovered that with those roles, she was able to be more dramatic, and she actually enjoyed that quite a bit. She thought, people are going to look at me and, they're going to think, she's not a sex symbol, she can also be an actress. But, of course, that didn't happen with Jayne. The press tended to be kind of harsh on her when she said she wanted to be a dramatic actress, just like they had been pretty harsh on Marilyn. And she actually found that she was kind of scorned for having, those ambitions.
Once again, our guest today is author April VeVea. The book is Puffblicity, An Appreciation of Jayne Mansfield, The 50s Pictures, Volume 1, Volume 2 forthcoming. And we'll continue this discussion in just a little bit. But first, here's Jayne along with Liberace and Lance Legault singing the song It's a Living.
It's a living.
That's a quasi-instrumental from Jayne Mansfield called Suey, featuring a young Jimi Hendrix on guitar there. And as we move into the 1960s for this half of the discussion, our guest today again, April VeVea, author of the book Puffblicity, An Appreciation of Jayne Mansfield, The 50s, Volume 1. And as we get into the 1960s, as you mentioned, her career started to take a downturn, and she was involved in some very odd projects. I remember one that had been in the public domain for a while. I used to see it all the time on VHS, The Wild, Wild World of Jayne Mansfield, where she was going, hosting a trip to burlesque houses or something.
So Wild Wild World was filmed actually in 1964. It was supposed to be, a travel log, which was extremely popular during that time. And the idea was Jayne would take you to these, I guess you could say, taboo spots around the world. They go to a drag club, which, of course, at the time was considered absolutely horrendous. She goes to a nude beach. There's, a few things with some ladies of the night, we'll say. And it comes across very, very desperate. The movie, like you said, it was in the public domain for a while. I think it has since been pulled out by some, little film company. And it's very interesting, to say the least. Jayne's latter career, though, is marked with these kind of harebrained schemes. She wants to be popular again. She wants to experience that stardom that she experienced from 56 to 58 again. And it's just, it doesn't happen. And she becomes a caricature of herself. She takes to wearing, sometimes 3 to 4 wigs at a time because she had lost all of her hair by 1962 from the bleaching, and she does this really extreme makeup and she's wearing, these extremely short mini dresses. I mean, she sadly becomes a caricature of herself. I don't think she knew right away, what had happened, but I think by probably the mid-60s, she realized that she was in a bit of a tailspin. She took to drinking a lot. I'm quite friendly with Jayne's third husband, Matt Sember, and he has been kind enough to share his recollections with me, and I have gone over, tons and tons of newspapers and stuff like that. Jayne was drinking quite a bit, and there's rumors of drug use during that time, and she wasn't at the top of her game, I guess we could say.
Around this same period, Jayne did something that has passed into legend. It may, in fact, be one of the main things these days that people talk about when they mention Jayne Mansfield, her association with Anton LaVey, and this idea, and there's a documentary film out about it as well, this idea that Jayne became a Satanist. What can you tell us about Jayne becoming a committed Satanist?
Okay, I actually have quite a lot of thoughts on this, but we'll try to keep it short.
Okay.
Anton LaVey claimed that Jayne was a Satanist in January of 1967, and Jayne heard about it, even though she was in Vietnam, and she released a statement saying that while she thought that Mr. LaVey was a very interesting man, she would always have a love of God, and she would never become a Satanist. And late May of 1967, she declares that she is going to convert to Judaism because her boyfriend at the time, Sam Brody, is Jewish. And then, of course, she passed away about a month later. Anton came back around. The first instance I can find of it is September of 1967, and he said, "Oh no, Jayne was a Satanist, and I put a curse on her and Sam, and that's why she died." There's nothing to support she was a Satanist. I actually own photos from an October engagement she did in Vancouver, Canada. And they were taken on October 23rd, and people claim that she visited Anton that night, but I own the photos that clearly show she was in Canada, so she was nowhere near San Francisco, where Anton was based. No one's ever been able to produce any documentation that shows she even visited the Black House in October of 66, and that's, for people who don't know, that was Anton's, I guess, religious Mecca, you could call it.
Right.
It was a house he had painted completely black in the middle of San Francisco. There's no pictures of her there. There's nothing in the papers from, 66 that say that she went there. I've never found any documentation from, a reputable Satanist to show that she was a member there. And in fact, Anton's daughter came out in the last few years and said Jayne wasn't a Satanist. So I'm assuming she wasn't one.
Well, as speaking as someone who is very much in the opposite direction of a Satanist, that's a relief to hear.
Yeah, and of course there are those pictures, and people think, I see those pictures of her with Anton as labeled being in the Black House. They actually weren't. They were taken in the Pink Palace, which was the name of Jayne's house. They were in early June of 1967, and it was just a very poorly done publicity stunt. It was, something Jayne thought would get her, in the papers and make her infamous, and it did, but kind of for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah. Her death is also a source of great speculation, and in reading your book, sort of an eerie coincidence, her father also died in an automobile, didn't he?
He did. He died in 1936 when Jayne was 3 years old. They were actually driving after Herbert, that's her father's name, after Herbert had a physical that said he was in perfect shape. They're driving up a hill, and it's Herbert driving, Vera Jayne, or Jayne, in the middle, and then her mother Vera on the right. And they're driving up the hill. All of a sudden, Herbert slumps over, and he had passed away from a heart attack at 33 years old.
And in the case of Jayne's death, it was a late-night drive on a foggy night, right?
That night was actually pretty clear. The police did a test with the mosquito fogger, and they found that the fogger would have put all of the fog onto the swamp where it was supposed to go. But Ronnie Harrison, the young man who was driving, was going on about 2 hours of sleep for the past 48 hours. Most likely he fell asleep at the wheel. I actually own the police report. It's like 60 pages and it's pretty graphic. So I won't go into details about it.
Sure.
But their theory was that he probably had fallen asleep at the wheel. Jayne injuries showed that she would have been awake when they hit, and she probably would have tried to shield herself. And Sam, who was sitting next to Jayne, would have probably been asleep.
As we look back over Jayne's life and career, which we've done a little bit of today, I think the movie that really stands out, that is just an immortal piece of cinema, and one that is certainly near and dear to the hearts of rock and rollers everywhere, is The Girl Can't Help It.
I absolutely love that movie. That was my second Jayne movie. My first one was actually Wild Wild World, so
okay.
I got a connection going on. You mentioned my first two Jayne movies. But I absolutely love that movie. Of course, Little Richard's in the movie. Eddie Cochran's in the film. And I would say, yeah, among music fans, I mean, that is definitely the movie to watch. And, of course, that movie brought the Beatles together because John Lennon and Paul McCartney were both very big fans. And
yes.
When Paul was going to, try out for John's band, he started playing a song from The Girl Can't Help It.
Yes.
And, they both loved that movie.
That's right, the song that Paul played for John. And what year is The Girl Can't Help It? Is it 57?
1956.
Okay, so it's just
December of 56.
So it's just a few months later that they meet, and Paul plays Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock, which is in the film. So you could indirectly say that Jayne Mansfield, not only does she deserve a statue in New Jersey, but you could also make the case that Jayne Mansfield brought the Beatles together. She needs a statue in Liverpool now.
She does. You know what? I think we should put statues of Jayne everywhere, and I'll go to the unveiling of all of them. But no, I mean, you're right. Jayne helped
in a way, yeah.
Yeah. And when the Beatles first came to the U.S. in '64, they were asked, what actor they wanted to meet, and they said Paul Newman, and what actress? And they said Jayne Mansfield.
See, there you go. Jayne Mansfield, the pivot point of 20th century pop culture. April, where would people go to get the previous book we just talked about, Puffblicity, Volume 1, and then Volume 2?
You can get it through Amazon or Barnes & Noble. You can get it through pretty much any book buying site, but those are the best to go through, or Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And then the second one will be on Amazon and Barnes & Noble as well.
All right, April, thanks so much for being on the show today, and we look forward to Volume 2 of the book, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me.